Our top story: Moscow has accused the United States of masterminding a drone attack on the Kremlin, a charge that has been denied by Washington and which has said that Ukrainian sabotage has reached unprecedented momentum. That's the allegation that's coming from Moscow. Russia has said that it reserves the right to retaliate, and hardliners, including former President Medvedev, have said that it should now physically eliminate Vladimir Zelensky. So that is the shrilling of rhetoric that's coming from Moscow. Now, dubbing US as the mastermind, the Kremlin spokesperson has said that, and I quote, that decisions on such attacks are not made in Kyiv, but in Washington. So that's what's happening at the moment. Kyiv only does what it is told to do. That is what Kremlin is saying, that such decisions are taken in Washington and not Kyiv. So a big charge coming there from Kremlin. Now, White House has denied this allegation of masterminding the Kremlin drone attack. They have said that this is just a blatant, bold lie. White House saying that US is not involved in the incident in any way. So US denying that attack. So what is Moscow saying? Moscow is saying that West is leading a war against Russia by proxy. That's an allegation that Moscow has maintained for a long time now, that West is leading this war against Russia by proxy. Now, there's a reaction coming in from the European Union as well. European Union Foreign Policy Chief's message for Russia: do not use this as an excuse to escalate the conflict. That's the danger at the moment. Escalation, a possible escalation of the conflict. Will Moscow use this as an excuse to escalate the conflict? We'll be analyzing that in a bit more detail, but let's move on. Now, Putin has spent a working day at the Kremlin just after that alleged drone attack in Kremlin. Moscow has flagged what it is calling an unprecedented wave of sabotage. Now, what is this apparent sabotage attacks? There have been trains derailed by explosions. There have been 2 train derailments in this week itself, in 2 days, on Monday and Tuesday. On Monday, in fact, an explosion caused a train to derail and catch fire near Yunek. And then on Tuesday, there was another train derailment. An explosive device derailed a Russian freight train in a region bordering Ukraine. So there has been train derailment, and there have been, let's go back to the previous page, there have been massive fires in annexed Crimea as well. That's also what Moscow is flagging as part of an unprecedented wave of sabotage. Massive fires in annexed Crimea. Let's give you a little bit more detail on that. A suspected drone hit an oil depot in Crimea and caused a huge blaze, and power lines were blown up near St. Petersburg. So that is also what Moscow is claiming as part of an unprecedented wave of sabotage. Now, all this is coming, remember, before the big holiday in Moscow, in Russia. Russia is preparing to mark one of its main holidays on the 9th of May. Why is that significant? This is the Victory Day that marks the Soviet win over the Nazis in the Second World War. So there's been a wave of so-called sabotage attacks that Moscow is claiming ahead of this main Victory Day celebrations. Now, lastly, after this drone attack, the alleged drone attack at the Kremlin, which Moscow says was an attempt on Vladimir Putin's life, they have now opened a terrorism probe that has now opened into that attack. So this is what is happening, the shrilling of rhetoric. Will this lead to something bigger? Let's go across to our guest who is joining us. We are being joined by Charles A. Kopchan, Senior Fellow, Council on Foreign Relations and Professor of International Affairs at Georgetown University. Thanks very much, sir, for speaking with WION.
Happy to join you.
Sir, I want to talk to you about this ramping of rhetoric from Moscow blaming Washington for the Kremlin drone attack. Now, with the facts that are in public domain at the moment and the strategies that you've analyzed of both Russia, Kyiv, NATO, Washington, is this just aggressive posturing, to win a battle of perception by Moscow, or can it lead to a possible escalation, something much more bigger, as EU foreign policy chief is worried about?
Well, there isn't a lot of hard information in the public domain. One would have thought that if the Russians have hard evidence that these drones flew from Ukraine, were under the direction of the Ukrainian government, that they would disclose that information. For example, intercepts of communications, flight path of the drone. There has been no such disclosure of information. And as a consequence, I think one has to view with skepticism the Russian claim that this was Ukraine and that this is part of a campaign of sabotage. For two different reasons, I would be very surprised if Ukraine was behind the attack. Number one, they're focused on the offensive, which is soon to begin. They want to use their military capability to get back territory. It doesn't make sense for them to provoke Russia by hitting the Kremlin. And secondly, the Kremlin has said that the U.S. is behind this attack. The U.S. has been telling the Ukrainians not to take shots against Russian territory. It would not be in the interests of the United States to see an escalation. So right now, I think the Kremlin's claims simply lack credibility.
Right.
Right. So also, given these developments, what options do you think both sides are left with? What would it take for the two sides to come to the negotiating table?
I think the negotiating table is rather far off. The Ukrainians are about to launch their offensive. The Russians have been fighting for the last few months further north around Bakhmut. Neither side seems ready to call it quits and try to negotiate an endgame. My best guess is we're going to see the offensive begin quite soon. As the weather gets warmer, the mud dries up, it's easier for Ukrainian tanks and armored vehicles to head toward the Russian front lines. I think we can expect a bloody summer. Then, maybe toward the end of this fighting season, when both sides are exhausted, both sides have taken a lot more casualties, it may be possible for the U.S. and others to try to broker a ceasefire and a diplomatic conversation, but we are certainly not there now.
All right, Professor Kapchan, thank you so much for joining us on this broadcast with your insights on this.
My pleasure.